Welcome everyone to today's Community Foundation CEO Virtual Roundtable. In partnership with CEO Net, we thank you for joining us today. And a few housekeeping items before we get started. We invite you to rename yourself if you haven't already in the participant list to include your name and organization. And feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and see where you're calling in from. There is a live transcript available at the very bottom of your screen to show the subtitles or the full live transcript. And today's conversation is being recorded and will be shared within our network if you miss anything for the resources that will be shared. Lastly, but not least, we invite you to engage in today's conversation using the Zoom features of the chat and to engage when we open up for discussion. At this point, I'm handing it over to today's moderator, Eric Ajali.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We also want to be certain to thank CEO Net for their continued partnership and peer community networking. I'm delighted to be able to open the conversation with a fantastic group of colleagues, and we hope that as they open up with their ideas, you'll also share your questions, concerns, and your experiences and really make this more of a roundtable discussion. You know, values-aligned philanthropy has taken roots. We hear it a lot, and we hear it in many different ways. It may be values-aligned philanthropy, as we're doing at the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation through our investments, or through PRIs and MRIs, through a strategy of alignment with the UN principles of responsible investing, or 100% move to ESG. But we're also looking at how we align our values to making ourselves more accessible and listening more to our community and letting them set the agenda for our philanthropy. And finally, and the real focus of what brought us together today, is we're also values aligned in who we fund. There's been a rise in anti-democratic extremism. There's been hate speech, violence in the US, and we've started to search for solutions to understand how hate groups are funded and where we may be at risk for making a misstep in funding the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, the Council on Foundations has provided some guidance and support on policies that many of our community foundations are establishing for our giving. And our goal today is to talk about how we ensure that we don't fund hate groups and other issues that align around those concerns of our values. And we want this to be a peer learning space. So I'm delighted to be joined by three peers that will share their insights and experiences as conversation starters and the way they've led their organization through this work along values-aligned philanthropy. We have Brian Fogle, President and CEO of the Community Foundation of the Ozarks, Ron Gallo, President and CEO of the Community Foundation of Louisville, and Ellen Gilligan, President and CEO of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. Let me start with you, Ron. You've had an interesting path to leadership from coast to coast, Rhode Island to Santa Barbara, and now you've found a place in Louisville at the Community Foundation of Louisville. And so having that experience with different communities, how have you focused on bringing values into your philanthropy with three very different types of organizations, boards, and staffing?
Well, thank you, Eric, and good to be with all of you. And what a thoughtful question. I think you provided some of the answer in your remarks about letting or leaning into the community actually defining our philanthropy. Whether it was Rhode Island, where we leaned into affordable housing, out in Santa Barbara, California, which is not just the place where Harry and Meghan and Oprah live. It has a lot of poverty and inequity, issues with undocumented folks. And we just kept, really growing our ears, so to speak, and recognizing that philanthropy, as wonderful as it is, has built itself on assets that were not always honorably obtained and grown, and that there were many people left out And the reason I say that is that as we now really emphasize decision-making being done in a shared way and really just changing a lot of our behavior, it is somewhat built on the fact that this is not just largesse, but that there is a reparative aspect of this that we just feel very strongly about. But I will hasten to say that, and it's something I said in the prep group, it reminded me of an incident in graduate school where we were dealing with something and everyone was feeling a lot of anxiety because it was very difficult and we all felt inadequate and scared. And finally, the professor just stopped and said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, this is hard." And you could just feel everyone's kind of temperature go down. And I just wanted to remind all of us that this stuff is hard. These are topics, race, class, that have always been difficult for America to talk about. And here now it's coming right into our work. And so it's a journey. There's a lot of uncertainty, but there's no substitute for being clear-eyed and strong, and yet meeting people where they are and bringing them along. And that's where the magic sauce is. So I'll stop with that as a starter.
Thank you. Now, Ellen, you've got a phrase for this: reimagining philanthropy, and you've started that journey with your board and your staff. What's that journey like? How did you get it started, and where are the speed bumps along the way?
Well, thank you. And it's great to see everybody. And I see a wonderful colleague from our region, Melissa Baxter, who I've worked with extensively. So great to see you, Melissa. You've been on a Zoom. So the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, as you, Eric, and Ron have already talked about, have been on this journey to reimagine philanthropy with really a couple of key aspects to it. One is to center community and community voice, and really put community priorities at the center of how we not only make decisions, but how we prioritize what we are investing in. The second is really to acknowledge, as Ron did, that for too long, philanthropy has been exclusive, and in this community, quite exclusively white dominated, and we reflect that as an institution. So we have been very clear about our goal to recognize that there's philanthropy in every aspect of this community, and that we are all philanthropists, and inviting everyone to come to the table. We released a strategic vision in 2020, which was a Milwaukee for All, that really invited people to come and join us in acknowledging that systemic racism is holding us all back. And then unless we come together as a community, we will not advance our aspirations to have a thriving community and region. There are many aspects to this work, and I'll just name a few, which you touched on, Eric, which is, this is sort of the way I think about it and talk about it. We made a commitment to use every tool in our philanthropic toolbox to advance this work. That's a technical term, everything from impact and mission investing, who manages our money, our cultural work, internally, declaring ourselves to be on a journey to becoming an anti-racist organization, inviting more people to the table, sharing power. So this is, we're really all in on this, and our focus on our anti-hate work is another level. And so I hope that we're going to get into that in addition. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Brian, the anti-hate work is something you're familiar with? The Foundation of the Ozarks has been engaged in this for several years. Could you tell us a little more about how you got this work started, what this work is, and where you see it going? Those are three questions that I'll be following up.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I think of the Sesame Street thing. One of these things just doesn't belong here. Here we have Louisville and Milwaukee, and then we're tucked away down here in the Ozarks. So we certainly represent a different geography in part. But I think that's one of the things that makes community foundations work so well, is that we're place-based and that we reflect and align with the values of the places we serve. And one of our biggest struggles, getting to challenges, Ellen and Ron, is that do we align or do we lead? And that's something that we wrestle with of what is our role. And our mission is to enhance the quality of life of all people in our region. That's our mission. We state that, and we're serious on that, and we focus on that. And I think one of the first things is that's the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And back in the fall of 19, I happened to read an article that was sent to me from someone in North Carolina about headlines in a paper of their community foundation funding hate groups. That was not anything ever on my radar. And so we started looking at that. And again, the first thing we did is reach out to Council on Foundations. We reached out to a lot of other community foundations. And we again started developing our policy again on something that wasn't not on our radar until seeing that headline. We also went back and looked at all of our grants, our donor advised grants, to see if they were on any of the hate lists. And fortunately, they were not. But I'll save the story for another day. But unfortunately, during this process of putting our grants process and our policy in order, we did have a request from one of our donor advisors to give a donation during this, and we didn't have a policy in place. And so that was, it was during that process. So we had to do a lot of soul searching there, but it has certainly been a journey, to echo what Ron and Ellen said. And again, just thankful for the camaraderie and the willingness of other community foundations to help us put that policy together. We did pass that in the spring of 2020 and have had that in place ever since, and that's helped guide us.
Thank you. Our foundation followed a similar path. We did a retrospective analysis of all the grants we made, tried to assess what the issues were, even talked to some of the donors who had historically made a grant, and found out quite pleasantly that we didn't need a large set of very complex policies. We simply said we wouldn't fund them. We identified who the they were, Southern Poverty Law Center being one of our lists in conjunction with work with Horizon Forum, but found that first time we called a donor, they thanked us for alerting them to where they were putting their money that they did not understand. That's one of the things we like about working with the Horizon Forum. We find that sometimes there'll be a shell corporation to a hate group, a Nazi youth camp in Minnesota that's funded through a Christian radio station that has a much simpler message to put forward in representing themselves. So it's been an education for us, but there were some bumps in the road. And question for all of you, how do you recommend doing this with your more conservative donors? How do you deal with some of those who you don't expect you to be doing this good work?
Well, I'll jump in first. Thanks, Eric. And again, we did during that interim, I had that same conversation. I called this donor up who had no idea. They were thinking this was promoting something that they weren't. And although she didn't like it, they did start just giving out of their own instead of the donor advised fund. And we kept that relationship with them because we had established that trust prior. And again, the other thing we had, even with some of our board members, is to, in this very polarized situation we find ourselves as a nation right now, is, there were some tendencies to want to politicize all of this. And going back, we focused again and again on our mission. And that helped us get over those humps. So I would say, I'm knocking on wood here, my wooden credenza. Since that time, that's the only time that's come up. We've not had to turn anybody else down due to that. We tried to do a good job of educating. We sent out our policy to everyone. We sit down with new donors when they have a donor advised fund to talk to them about our policy, and that has helped a lot.
So I will add on to what Brian said. First of all, I want to acknowledge Dr. Jolly's leadership in this arena because the Horizon Forum's work and the council really bringing together the Horizon Forum is really due to the advocacy of Dr. Jolly, and really, us really begging, beseeching, encouraging the council to help us as a field deal with this in an objective way. So I really want to acknowledge that and thank the council and the Horizon Forum for the work that they're doing. So I just want to, we live in Wisconsin, which is a very politically divided state. And our work around our hate policy really began before the Horizon Forum was established and before this began. And it began in a way that, so we had a protest after George Floyd's death, and we had a professional advisor who spat in the face of a young protester, a juvenile, who was protesting legally. That really caused our board to really take action immediately to separate ourselves from this professional advisor, who was also an advisor on a fund. She was not only referring clients, but also was an advisor on a fund of someone she had, provided legal assistance to. So our board took action immediately to separate ourselves from that advisor, to use their variance power to take that fund into a final purpose and pay out the fund as it was established by the donor. As it turned out, the donor would have been abhorrent about some of the work that, certainly the action that this person took, but was very much aligned with the kinds of values that our community foundation stands for. That caused us to really look at our ethics policy, and with the advice of our general counsel, to not establish a hate policy or an anti-hate policy per se, but take it up to a different level to create an ethics policy that covered the entire foundation and everyone associated with it, that would allow us to take action that was not aligned with our ethics policy. So we moved from a what I would say is a fiduciary related ethics policy and anti-discrimination ethics policy to a much more values aligned ethics policy. And we are in the process of implementing that across the organization, having similar conversations with donors. It's embedded in our donor advised fund guidelines, et cetera. It's interesting. Some of our donors say, well, we thought you were always doing this. And then others, we've had some conversations, and they are happy to know that we are taking these steps. And we've had some conversations about redirecting their gifts or having other organizations that they might support. we have a couple of situations where our board is going to have to probably use variance power again on some directed gifts, legacy gifts. So that's, I think, going to be, it's an ongoing conversation among our board about how this is going to be implemented, how we will use the Horizon Forum tool, which we do, but it raises all the kinds of questions that Brian and Eric and Ron have already raised about how these groups have somehow been politicized, and that we are trying to, again, depoliticize the work and connect it to our values and our ethics policy at the highest level.
Thank you, Ellen. I love hearing how you brought your board into this and you continue to put them at the center with these values. We used this when I first came on as a goal and mentioned that goal in every board member recruitment. So gradually our board was ready for this. At one point, we took the Southern Poverty Law Center list to our 3 most conservative board members and invited them pre-COVID to sit in a room together and explore the websites of those places that were listed and tell me if there was anything defensible. And they became some of our most vocal supporters of putting an end to those funding and putting screens in place. But bringing the board along was key for us. Now, Brian, how did you bring your board to this?
We gradually, first of all, again, I brought that up after I'd seen that headline and actually used a mock-up of that in our board meeting to say, what if this was CFO on the front page? How would you feel about that? So we then, when we introduced that, they were saying, yes, we need a policy, let's explore that. And we brought them along as we learned too, as we reached out to others and put that together. Again, we don't, Ellen, I love your ethics policy. We don't call ours a hate group policy or whatever. We talk it about, again, on a more positive, that we're here to fund groups that do well and talk about that. And I think it was, how we framed it was important. In the middle of it, though, dealing with that one request we had, that made it real. We didn't have the policy yet in place. Our staff had a lot of problems because all of a sudden we lifted that up and they're saying, oh my gosh, what do we do with this? We don't have a policy. That was a struggle, but it made it real for our board. And I think then made it, oh, this is something we have to deal with. So it was a learning experience for all of us. We brought them along the way. And again, that's part of all of our orientation now, to talk about that and why we do it, et cetera. The other thing we put in our policy is that we believe in the First Amendment and free speech, et cetera. It's just, again, we're not making judgment on people's ability to make donations wherever they want to make them. It's just that if you have a donor advised fund and it's going to a group that we don't think aligns with our values and our mission, we're not going to do it through us. And that's how we've approached it.
Thank you. Ron?
Yeah, I just want to underline what the last 2 comments, particularly Ellen's, about broadening this to really the whole organization. Luckily, we were launching a strategic plan just about 6, 7, well, more like 8 months ago now. That gave us the platform and the processes to dig into these issues. And I think we made more progress because of that. And it ended up in really redefining our mission statement, our values, and understanding that it has to be practiced in everything. It's not just about an anti-hate policy for donor advised funds. I think, as you had maybe suggested, Eric, earlier, it's how you're investing your assets. It's about your loan programs. It's about who's deciding on this. I mentioned that briefly before, but it's not just giving more. It's a number of our grant programs now are decided by populations that receive the grants, so that it's not paternalistic in the traditional sense. On the specific issue of anti-hate, we actually, it might be contrary to perception, but we are in Kentucky, but we're in Louisville, and Louisville is actually a fairly progressive, democratic bastion or oasis surrounded by different sensibilities. So actually, most of our donors overwhelmingly greeted well these new policies. And when we did a kind of a look back, we only found 3 grants in the last 10 years that we wouldn't have made going forward. Having said that, I think some of the nuances is where we do start with the Southern Poverty Law Center as a trigger. But there are issues that are more on the borderline depending on where you live. And what some would say is hate, others might say is a different point of view. Clearly, this is true in the abortion arena in a state like Kentucky, where it might be viewed differently, that issue, and organizations aligned on one side or the other than it would be in New York City or something like that. So eventually ultimately you can't escape the fact that these are difficult things, but I think you come back to an organization that is guided by principle and ethics and clearly states those. In the long run, I think organizations like that tend to prosper. And that's what we're kind of being guided by. So
that's what my next question was, how have you responded to pushback? What pushback have you had, and what was the result? In our case, we had a few interesting examples. After the murder of George Floyd, we funded Black Lives Matters and trained them how to protest more effectively, because quite honestly, as an old AIM kid, American Indian Movement, it was pathetic. They needed help. They used that, and we had a number of donors who were very upset about it until the chief of police publicly posted a letter saying it's a lot easier to work with trained protesters than amateurs. When we spoke out against the Dar al-Farouk mosque bombing, we lost $10 million in deeply Christian donors who just didn't want to see us partnering with the Muslim community. But we gained $30 million in donor advised funds. We offer Sharia compliant funds for the Muslim community. And so in balance, we've found that living our values has invited the community to join us in those values. Have any of you had experiences where you had unexpected pushback and hopefully positive outcomes or negative outcomes that you had to deal with?
We represent, again, 60 counties. We're a regional community foundation. We have 53 affiliates, and many of them are rural. So we did have pushback from some of our rural board members. But the interesting thing was none of their donors had ever made grants from that list. So, once we kind of explained that we're not here to police ideology of our donors or whatever, but we're here to ensure that we believe in the dignity of all people. And again, going back to our mission, once we kind of explain, we have not had pushback since then. But I found it sort of interesting is that those who even initially had pushback, they had never had any donors that had tried to do that. So that made the explanation easier, I guess.
Thank you. And so as we look at this, I want to take a moment to pause and see, we've had some wonderful information exchange in the chat room. Does anyone else have experience they'd like to speak to out there in our community here, or questions that you'd like to ask? Now, Brian, you've done a bit of this work, And I know you went beyond just Southern Poverty Law Center. What are some of the other resources that you, Ron, or Ellen have relied upon?
We not only do we look at, and I would say Southern Poverty Law Center is the primary one we use to screen, but we've even had some where we question and just go out and do Google searches of what are they doing, what are those things that they're supporting, to get a little bit of background. You'd mentioned, Eric, your example of somebody promoting this. It's actually running a student youth camp for authoritarianism. So if there's something questionable, we try to dig a little bit deeper than just looking at the list to see what else it is. And we've got some folks that are really good at that, of taking it a step further.
Eric,
Yes.
one time when I was listening to you or another webinar on this, you talked a little bit about like the staffing structure, and I liked how you sort of referred to sort of steps in the process so that it doesn't go to you right away. That, you know, could you just maybe reflect on how you all have structured this internally?
I'll be glad to review that from my own point of view. I like to have multiple opportunities to diffuse things at the lowest level. So we often start with a call to the donor, an awareness of the donor, of what the consequences would be if they were publicly identified with this sort of behavior. That usually stops the problem there. And from there to the supervisor of the person who made that first call. From that supervisor to our senior VP. And if it gets to me, that's usually chilling to individuals. Think they just, the title is a wonderful thing. And knowing that our board will act, and that it will be a part of our minutes, which are shared with the Attorney General's office. So it's an escalation in resistance, but we have never had it escalate through the full plan. What about the rest of you here on this call? How have you stepped it? We really do have multi-step, which means training, by the way, of the staff in playing through scenarios, in role playing with board members who are far more conservative than our staff. That's been really helpful. And we catch words that are used inappropriately or that accelerate rather than decelerate, that focus on defending a freedom rather than looking at what the implication of the proposed action is. And we keep focusing on, this is what the group is doing. This is what you are being on record in supporting, not you're doing this to support free speech. There are other ways to do that, and we'll show you how. Ron,
Eric.
Brian, or Ellen?
Oh, Eric, I had a question. You had mentioned that you have Sharia, that donor advised funds that operate under Sharia law. And I'm just wondering, can you talk a little bit more about what that means and how you, I think it was Eric that said.
Yes. Yeah, we have an option. We have several options for fund investment for our donors. We manage most of our own investments, but we outsource to an organization that manages Sharia compliant investments. These are investments which don't earn traditional interest and have been reviewed by clerics to be Sharia compliant. We disclose the return rate that those are making for increased assets for community distribution. That's an important wording I've been coached on. We are increasing the assets for community distribution. Sharia compliant funds, I will tell you, my staff said, wow, it's wonderful that we're doing this. And I said, well, how long have you worked here that you didn't do this? And when we opened this door to the Muslim community, they came flooding through. It was really a wonderful value for us. I will disclose that almost all of their donor advised fund activity outside of education writ large, higher ed generally, as we see a lot of our donors do. Almost all of it, the great majority of it, has been on interfaith dialogue. And they're funding our Council of Churches to look at repair and reparations. It's really a remarkable experience to have opened the doors of philanthropy to that community. So, and there are any number of advisors. If you want to contact Jeremy Wells, my vice president for philanthropic programs, we can share with you the advisors who we bid through. And we had 4, I think, that we bid through, 2 that we settled on, and our donors have chosen really just one who has a stellar reputation nationally. Any other?
So I was just going to comment on the process that we use. We don't have the hammer that Eric is using. We do have a cross-functional staff team that our due diligence begins with, really any donor advised fund or any grant that goes through has, our due diligence process that begins in finance and looks at the Horizon Forum tool to see if any of the organizations, we assume that, we know that any of our discretionary grants are not on that list, but any donor advised funds grants that are on the list, then that triggers another review, a discussion with our vice president for development and philanthropic services, a conversation with the donor, and then if the board is required to take action, as I said earlier, with regard to variance power, then we have a mechanism where it comes to our me, to our CFO, and then to the board. So our first review is a staff review, and as Eric said, it has required a significant amount of training for both our finance team, but more importantly for our development and philanthropic services team with regard to how these conversations go with donors and the kinds of conversations they're having with regard to why we're doing this, how we're doing it, how we're using the tool, and what the next steps are.
Thank you. I would say we've only had to escalate to the hammer once, and it was an intention of the donor to have it escalate. So thank God the CEO also got to practice with those recalcitrant board members. So, now, all of you have talked about putting the community at the center of your work, increasing the impact of those to decide, for some of you to help them, have them set your agenda for you. We did that here early on, and we have 3 words for it because 3 words are easier for my staff to rally around than 3 pages of my notes. We are concerned, as we always will be, with who benefits, right? How many children were served, how many seniors, how many disenfranchised voters were encouraged, all of those things. But we ask, in addition to who benefits, now we ask who informs and who forms. The question who informs is really who set the agenda. I'm happy to talk about the Gila River Reservation, where we have nearly 80% diabetes among men at age 35 and older, and a government that wanted to provide assisted memory care living, when if you ask that community, well, that's a very valuable thing, they'd like to live long enough to worry about needing assisted memory care living. Their priorities are different because of their experiences. So we ask who informs, who set the agenda, who identified the problem that we are going to deal with in our community. And we ask who forms, who actually constructed the solution. Do they speak literally or figuratively the language of the community? Is it a resolution that is culturally consonant with the community? So those are fine. We ask who informs, forms, and benefits, but we're stressed over who inspires. If you've lived in poverty your whole life, your horizon isn't as far as someone else's might be. Your imagination of what you could ask for. When a young person asks me, "Mister, do you have a quarter? I'm hungry." I'll say, "What are you going to buy with a quarter? Tell me you're hungry and ask for a meal." How do we get people to imagine something better? Not to imagine subsidized rent, but home ownership, the building of wealth. How have any of you faced this as a challenge, and how, when you start sharing power with the community, can you share and find their place of inspiration? I'd really love to know if anyone's addressing it, because we're still scratching our heads trying to find ways of doing it. We're bringing in people and advisors and trying to tell stories, but we haven't found a solution.
Well, I don't know if we've found a solution, Eric, but I think in your 3 approaches, you begin to fertilize the ground on that. I'll give you a short anecdote. We were given a piece of property in the historic Black neighborhood by a donor, said, "Do good things with it." And for 3 or 4 years, it was before I came here, we proposed all these nice things, a park, a health clinic. What we hadn't done is actually get into the neighborhood and see what they wanted. So we went back to scratch, but in so doing, I want to insert an activity that was very important for us. And that was going to that community and saying, "We messed up." Actually giving them a forum to vent on us about how we had, with all good intentions, acted in their way, very typical privileged white philanthropy way of telling us all these wonderful things that we needed, and how we reacted to that, which was listening and not being defensive, I think was a very important first step in that. But then we went to the work of getting those right informants, and that wasn't easy. They weren't a heavily organized neighborhood. Some of it due to what you mentioned about kind of the poverty of perspective that had grown. But we introduced into that mix other leaders from aligned neighborhoods who we had worked with, and they in turn were more trusted. But I'll get to the punchline is that we ended up giving, not selling. It was supposed to be a sale, by the way, and then have a fund for the neighborhood. And that converted into giving the piece of land, 2 acres, to a newly formed land trust made up of local folks who are now going to decide what they want to do with that land. Now, we had some pushback at the board that we weren't being responsible to the donor, that even though this all sounds nice, don't we have the expertise in all of these things? And we worked through all of that. And on the day of the press conference, the donors were there with huge smiles. So it was a completed circle on a journey that we took that I think really is, there's no magic answer, but I think success breeds success. And out of that project has now come all kinds of incubators and things that have lifted what you're saying, the perspective of folks. But I will end with this on this, is that on the other hand, the other thing that we are building a muscle for is for people who have not made a lot of decisions of consequence, haven't been allowed to, I should say, making mistakes and not sitting there and saying, aha, you see, they didn't do it right, because we have a long list of mistakes that we've made, and that hasn't prevented us from going back to work the next day and staying with our mission. So there's so many aspects to this that are very nuanced, very layered, and there's no substitute for just staying with it.
And
Thank you.
Eric, just on that question of especially poverty that you brought up. So we, back in 1999, our poverty rate here in Springfield was below the national average, below the state average. And it seemed like we woke up one day and we're beyond everybody's. We went from 9.7% those living at or below poverty to 26% in that 15-year period of time. And our grant making, a lot of it, probably the majority other than education, went to poverty alleviation. We took a long, hard look saying, what we're doing isn't working. I mean, if we're investing millions and the rate keeps going up. So we looked across the country, did a lot of research, and we found a program down in Jacksonville, Florida called 1,000 and 1,000 that, again, very research-based. DuPont Foundation helped put that together, and we brought that back. We had them come up and speak to us, and we launched a program based on that. And what we did is say, here are the, here's the model, but we went to the nonprofit community and said, you're the experts here. You tell us how you would put this together. We did an RFP instead of just a traditional grant request. And we had 4 different responses. And the one that did it was a group of 15 nonprofits that came together. And we made a 5-year commitment. That was very, very important. And the good thing is it's worked, and it's very cohort based. They get together every week, these groups that go forward. The other thing you mentioned, MRIs and using our capital for other things. We worked with a credit union because Missouri's got the worst predatory lending laws in the country. We're the most lenient. And we refinanced about $700,000 of payday loans in the cohorts going through there. We put a loan loss reserve in the credit union, and it's working out so well. So it's great to see something that have a success, and I'm very, very proud of that. They have now taken that same cohort, and they're now in rural areas throughout Missouri, taking that same model. So, but it was realizing what we had been doing and an acknowledgement to say we're obviously failing was the very first step.
Well, thank you both. I appreciate this. Honestly, you've helped me answer that question. Some of you know, among the time I spent too much time in college, I got a degree as an electrical engineer. And this month's issue of Institute of Electrical and Electrical Engineers magazine called Potentials has an entire chapter on failure, how to bank it, how to work with it, how to document it. And I've made it required reading for my executive leaders without knowing why. And now I know. So I so appreciate that. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask all of our panelists to think of what their summary reflections are and the things they want to say that I wasn't wise enough to ask about. But I did get a private chat on, is there more to that story? And the story that they were referring to was the funding of Black Lives Matter. And that's, yes, there is. So I'm going to take a moment to share that because as Ron had pointed out through his anecdote, I think stories are powerful. Decades upon decades ago, I was a fellow for the Kellogg Foundation. And back when Battle Creek was not the large metropolis that it still isn't today, they would send a driver to pick me up. Frank would come, and Frank was the talkative guy. He was the guy who also had the place on the corner where all the kids would go to play. If you needed to find your child after school, it'd be Frank's house. Well, Frank was excited today. He had a story about a young man he called Mr. Klutz. And Mr. Klutz hadn't been around for a while. All the kids grew up. They didn't stop by. And Frank was out on his lawn. He saw this young man walking by with a full head of seed and looking terribly agitated. And Frank said, what's wrong? And the kid said, oh, I just had a huge fight with my father. What kind of a fight? Well, I was mowing the lawn. And he said, you were mowing the lawn. You had a fight with your father. Why? He said, well, I had an itchy nose. And Frank's getting impatient. He said, you had an itchy nose while you were mowing the lawn. How did you get a fight with your father? He said, well, I scratched my nose. Frank was still stunned. He said, and it's a self-propelled mower. My mother's flowers are gone. Well, his father said horrible things. He said bad things. He said, I don't even know if I can go home anymore. I don't know what to do. And Frank was brilliant. He said, here's what I want you to walk a little further than you had planned. And when you turn the corner, think about what you can do to show your father you're sorry. Like rake up the flower petals or take out the trash. And the young man said, you think? And he said, yeah, just do that. Don't say anything. And then Frank ran in the house as the young man disappeared around the corner, and he called the kid's father, and the father said, oh my gosh, that kid's going to be the death of me. You know, I said horrible things. I didn't mean them. I don't know what I'm going to do. I've got a temper. And Frank said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to just watch and see if he does anything to show you he's sorry, like rake up the flower petals or take out the trash. And if he does, just give him a hug. Well, that brilliant, wonderful man taught me something that I've tried to follow. That is, we all gather the seeds of change, but we also have to create a fertile environment. He did both. And so we funded Black Lives Matter on how to be protesters. And we funded the police on how to work with trained protesters. And we funded an intermediary to show them how to talk to each other. And that's how that program was truly successful. The quiet funding of both sides towards a place where they could be themselves. Proper policing, proper protesting. The protests were heard. We funded the media to follow the protesters so that their stories were told. And with the stories being told, there was less need to shout. That's the rest of that story. So thank you for listening. I do want to now ask our three panelists to take a moment to summarize for us before we close, a few minutes. And I don't know where to start, but Ron, you're leaning forward, so you get the
Okay. Well, this has been a pleasure. And as always, it's what others have said that have really sparked my imagination. And I just want to pick up on two things. One is that in the stories that Eric just told, there was a lot of funding of advocacy. And I think that's something that's for some foundations, it's routine, but for many, it's still something that we struggle with. And I've just come to the point where if you say you care about education, if you care about anything, and you're not willing to go from just funding a program to funding advocacy that multiplies the effects of good programs, then you might have to stop saying that you care about that issue. And so a number of times today in this last hour, I've heard about very effective funding of advocacy. And I think that's just really something that we need to keep in mind. The other one is about who's the expert. And I think, Brian, you mentioned DuPont. I imagine you meant the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund, which I actually ran so many decades ago that I don't want to mention what the year was. But I remember funding a program in North Carolina then about increasing prenatal care. And the RFP went out, and this is the short version, UNC applied and all this, but the grant actually went to 16 Black grandmothers in Lee County who had the trust of the young women in ways that no one in a white coat and a van could provide. And that program really, really worked. And it was the earliest reminder of keeping open about who's the expert on any issue. It more often than like might be right inside the group that you're trying to help.
Thank you. Brian, your closing thoughts?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think if anybody can help in this time of polarization, it's community foundations. And I was a banker for 30 years, a commercial lender, went to many, many conferences. My first community foundation conference, everybody hugged each other. There was laughter, and I thought, I found my people. So I think we serve this very important role as the even-handed convener. And I'll tell a brief story, Eric, that yours reminded me of. We funded something many years ago on, we called it the Values Project. And it was, what are those values in our community we wanted to pass along to our progeny? That was the whole issue of it. We did all these surveys, and the first two came across loud and clear of hard work, and The one that came up though that we weren't sure, it was like live and let live and all that. So the folks putting that together put tolerance around it. And tolerance, unbeknownst to me and all of those, this has been years ago, was not a good word for many people. And so it created this whole uproar. And I had this gentleman come to my office and was very, very upset, who just said, "You're promoting a lifestyle I don't agree with." And I raised his voice. And just when I was getting ready to stand up and ask him to leave, he just paused. And he sunk in his chair and tears came in his eyes. And he said, "I lost my son to AIDS many years ago." And that reminded me that people have a lot of stories, and their wounds and their bitterness might come from a place we don't understand. And had I not taken the time and listened to him, that could have ended up very, very differently. So I try to do that every time. We try to do that as a foundation, is to stop and listen, ask stories, and again, be that conduit, that even-handed convener that maybe can help us get through this. So I just want to say thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege to be with all of you, and especially Ellen, you and Ron and Eric. Thanks for including me.
Thank you for your wisdom. Ellen, we save the last word for you.
Well, thank you. And as always, I always learn far more in these conversations than I have to share. And I'm so delighted to be part of this conversation and hear really the centering of our values back to the top of why we're here, and our values as community foundations in building inclusive communities that benefit, that where everyone can share in the benefits, right? That's what we share. And that's what we say that we as community foundations are about. What is the common good where everyone can thrive? And I'm always heartened by these conversations that continue to focus on putting community at the center of what we are focusing on. While we're talking about donors, while we're talking about bridging divides, we are community focused in addition to being a place where everyone can have a seat at the table. So I really, I think that the role that community foundations can play in places across the country with big divides is so critically important. And so I really appreciate the conversation and being part of it. And I'd love to learn from all of you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all, Brian, Ron, Ellen. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom. I especially appreciate the participants who stayed with us through this entire program. It's inspiring that we are indeed a community of ourselves in support of each other. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the conversation. If you are interested in learning more about this work or to be a part of the Values Aligned Philanthropy Peer Learning Circle, fill out an interest form that we're going to put in the chat. And you can keep this conversation going at the Philanthropy Exchange. With that, I'm turning it over to Christy and say we ended on time.
You did such a great job. Thank you all so very much for saying yes to our ask. Thanks to the Council of Foundations for partnering with CEOnet and offering these roundtables. We hope to have one more before year end. And I think your parting comments, all of your closing comments, were such a great segue into the continued conversation we plan to have at the CEOnet retreat coming up September 8th and 9th. So I hope to see some of you there. It's not too late to register, so just check out ceonet.org. It's also time to renew your membership dues. So you can do that at that website as well. Again, thank you everyone for the work you do every single day to make our communities better together.
Thank you all. Have a good night.